So I have my blood cells generating. They're following along the spline, and there's a couple of things that obviously I'm not too crazy about, and that's the amount of blood cells that are, or particles that are being generated, how closely packed together they are, and how uniform both they follow the spline and their motion through space. And so I'm going to start to add some variation on all of this. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the standard particle emitter, and I'm going to start to tweak the particle numbers just a little bit. So I'm going to cut them in half just to see how that changes the scene. And that'll give you something to at least start working with. The next thing I want to do is I want to go to the follow spline, and there's a point velocity value. If I look down into the thinking particles, just underneath segmentation, there's a point velocity. And what the point velocity does is it references how closely the center of our geometry follows the spline that we've established. Now we have just a little bit of room to play with here, and it's a positive value from 1 to 0, and we could set this to 0.001, and now when I hit play, you can see that there's a little bit of variation in terms of where the particles are starting and how closely they're following the spline. In fact, we can set this to 0, and we're getting essentially the same results as 0.001, but if we go into a negative value, if I set this to -1, then it basically just completely ignores the spline, which is not at all what we want to do. So we want to keep that value somewhere between 0 and 1, and I don't believe we can go less than 3 decimal points. So I'm just going to set that to 0.001, and that looks pretty good. Now, if I want this to be a little bit more dramatic in terms of the amount of sort of leeway off the spline that I have, I should be able to relatively adjust the animation. And what I mean by that is if I go to the blood cell, I suspect that if I scale this down, this blood cell way down, that the relative scale of the animation and the degree to which those elements are off the spline start to make a little bit more sense. So I've given myself some breathing room just based on the size of the geometry that I've generated. In other words, I couldn't increase the distance with which those blood cells moved away from the spline, so I just I scaled that geometry down. That seems to do the trick. Okay, so I'll just kind of zoom in a little bit here, and I'll hit play. That looks pretty good. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take the standard emitter, and I'm going to start to play with some of the values that I find in the spin. And so I think what I'll do here, let me just hit play and start to play with these values and see if I can start to adjust some of these. So I just slid the spin, and that didn't seem to do anything at all. So I'll just bump up the spin axis, let's say 45 in that first field, and that's a little too fast. So let me try to take down the spin. That's not what I want to do. Let me bump the spin axis down to 1. There we go. That seems to be a little bit more what I want. So I'm going to play back and forth between the spin value. It seems like I'm getting some interesting results here. I think I want that spin value set to about 1. Yeah, there we go, 1. And I'll set the spin axis in a couple of different directions. I'll set all 3 of them to 1, see what we come up with. So if I set them all to 1, they don't seem to be as dramatic. In fact, that almost causes them to level off. So maybe if I increase some variation in there. Okay, I'll just set these back to, I'll choose one axis and apply 1 to it. And that's just about what I want. I think that's looking pretty good in terms of how the blood cells are moving, how they're starting to rotate. I am getting some variation in there, so I'll just bump that variation down just a little bit, get them all to spin. And I kind of like that animation that's established. Now, that animation will run indefinitely, and that would have taken me a long time to create that animation without thinking particles. So I'm pretty happy, pretty satisfied with that. So I'll move on. I can always come back and kind of tweak these values, but what I'll do is I'll start to think about the environment and the staging. Maybe I'll apply a few additional effects, but already I think I have most of at least the animation established. Now I need to work on the lighting and the staging and think about how I'm going to present this animation. So we'll push this forward in the next presentation.